room got bigger. My name is Dr. Paula Loanide. I am blessed to be here and share this space with you all. Thank you so much to all the conference organizers, especially these amazing students who I know worked really tirelessly to put this together. And to my colleague, Dr. Sean Eversley-Bradwell, our whole crew is here from the Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity at Ithaca College. Our director, Dr. Barles, and Dr. Licon is on this team of people that on our campus are trying to really kind of shift the way that we talk about diversity so that it's not just a code word, right, for all of the different things that Dr. Eversley-Bradwell mentioned, but that we keep disrupting the idea of diversity insofar as it doesn't also address power, right? So I'm going to talk about white racism as a way to talk about this grand disparity that we're seeing in higher educational contexts, right? Where supposedly the interest is for more inclusion and equity, right? But what we see over and over and over again in the outcomes, in who actually gets access to college, and then what happens once, right, people are there, the fact that almost all of these predominantly white colleges assume a kind of culture of whiteness, right, without naming it as such, and then also kind of assume that in the disciplinary ways in which your classes are being taught, right, so that race is this add-on, or gender is an add-on, or sexuality is an add-on to what otherwise is considered normative, right? And instead, what we need to do is really change our lens to also interrogate, what I'm trying to do today a little bit with you, right, is to also interrogate whiteness and white racism rather than leave it as the normative thing against which everything else gets compared, right? Which is, of course, people of color or women or so on and so forth, right? I wanted to know from you guys, where are the white people in the salad bowl metaphor that was used earlier? Which one, what are they? Are they the lettuce? Are they tossed in the salad? They're fixing it? What do other people think? The ranch? I like that one. No offense, right, to the metaphor. But let's get real, right? The salad bowl is not an equal opportunity situation where everybody just gets to be their various little difference. The salad bowl has hierarchies of power. It's an order in which people enter, right? People don't just come to the United States into this sort of equal setting where everybody just gets to kind of highlight their difference and then go about their way. As Dr. Bradwell was saying, right, there are enormous consequences for those differences. There's enormous, tension when it comes to walking in one way versus walking in another way, right? Depending on, are you wearing, a veil because you are a Muslim? What does it mean to be the only student of color in an all-white classroom where the professor is also white, who has never thought to consider race or gender or any of the other isms that we talk about, right? So anyway, so that's the preface to my talk. So, 10 steps towards anti-racist praxis. The idea here for me was to take the other end of Dr. Eversley-Bradwell's talk, right? If diversity kills, who's doing the killing? So let's first define the problem. We're used to thinking about racism primarily as the purposeful creation of disadvantages for people of color, right? You could take this on other isms, sexism and so on, right? But we're gonna focus again on a race framework. So what does that mean? That means that there are purposeful disadvantages created through practices, through policies, through everyday cultures, right? That produce these consequences. And the consequences are, not having as much of an opportunity or as much of access to the ability to accumulate wealth, home ownership, Mortgage lending discrimination leads to people not being able to get loans. Discrimination in educational opportunities that start from the neighborhood in which you go to school, K through 12, right? Differences in income, like Dr. Bradwell was pointing out. Major differences in health risks, right? And being subjected to environmental hazards because you live in a particular neighborhood, right? All of these things, if you look at them systemically, right, produce these enormous disadvantages. Now, that is a very important thing. Many of the panels today accounted for how this stuff works. Mass incarceration is one panel I went to. Another panel I went to talked about the medical profession and the way that it targets people of color and using their DNA literally without compensating them, right? I want to suggest that we generally don't think about the other side of the equation of racism, which is the purposeful creation of advantages for whites in many of the same areas. So if we put it together, right, we see that there's a relationship going on. It's not just that racism produces discrimination, disadvantage, and lack of opportunity for people of color. It's that through that disadvantage, it creates advantages for whites. Does that make sense to people? Can I get a nod? Okay, all right. So you're walking with me. This is important. Okay, so this is how we define systemic racism, not just individual acts of bigotry, which are of course part of this whole thing, right? But literally all the cumulative history that we're talking about, right, that adds up to this enormous difference, right? How do we normally talk about this problem though? That's not what usually people account for. You guys, because you're a student and you're studying, etc. That's not how this problem, this disparity, this inequality is generally explained, right? The way that disadvantages that people of color experience as a result of white racism, the history, a cumulative history of white racism in the United States, is explained away usually through the rhetoric that you can see there on your left, right? Bad behavior, cultural dysfunction, lack of work ethic, right? The fact that, Latina and black women have too many babies. A sense of lack of personal responsibility. The fact that you have poor education, right? All of this, all of a sudden, instead of being understood as a systemic thing that got very purposely produced, becomes a kind of blame the victim mentality, right? Where the people who have been discriminated against and who have been subjected to various forms of barriers, right? Intergenerationally, all of a sudden it becomes their fault that they're not doing well enough compared to whites, right? How do whites explain their own advantages? We're hard workers. We worked really hard and we deserve to be there. We behave better, purportedly, right? That we have a sense of personal responsibility. That there's an absence of dependence on the state and on others. That we have good family structure, right? Or proper family structure defined as, we have the right number of kids, the mother and the father, and so on and so forth, right? Now, please don't mistake, I'm not saying this. I'm saying what most white folks say when they try to explain the inequalities that are very clear that exist everywhere in the society and especially in higher education, okay? So I want to talk about this process of white folks avoiding the problem. I'm talking specifically to the white folks in the room, and for the students of color here, I'm going to write a book called White People's Secrets, Your Survival Kit to Higher Education, in which I'm going to tell you all the secrets so you don't suspect that this isn't happening, right? Because there's a crazy-making process, right, when whites don't admit this, right? And I want to talk about what are the defense mechanisms, the dominant defense mechanisms that white folks use to avoid admitting what the history of advantage has produced in their lives, right? Whether they ask for those advantages or not. That's the whole point of privilege, is that you get it whether you wanted it or not. It's an inheritance. Just like for people of color, there's an inheritance of disadvantage, right? Okay, number one, ignorance. You've heard these before, right? I mean, anyone can make it. Now I'm going to do my white girl talk. All right. I know. But it's so much fun. But this idea, right? Anyone can make it if they work hard enough, right? Racism is this thing that took place in the past. We're better now, right? Have you heard this? Right? That comes out of a structured ignorance about the extent to which white advantage was purposely produced, right? So people come up with dominant explanations for this, right? So I had a big debate one day with two of my women of color friends, two of my best friends. One is African American, one is of Persian descent. And they were trying to say to me that there is just no way that white people don't know how much privilege and advantage that they have. And that most of white people's racism is intentional and motivated, right? I couldn't identify with that story because in my own experience, right, of coming to consciousness around white racism, I couldn't remember the time when I could put it all together and be like, yes, I have all these advantages. What you learn as a white person is primarily the ideologies that cover up the fact that this happened and how it happened, right? So we were having this debate. Do white people know or don't they know? And the function of ignorance is to make sure that people buy into the dominant explanations for why whites have the advantages that they do, right? Instead of admitting the real history, right? But that doesn't save you from actually practicing racism, right? Just because you don't know you're producing these outcomes as a white person doesn't mean that you're not actually producing the outcomes, right? So ignorance is very important here because it constantly reproduces a situation where intentional or unintentional, the outcomes are still the same, right? The outcomes are still producing all of this discrimination, this violence, and so on and so forth, right? Denial and disavowal. Well, I didn't own any slaves, so I don't know what this has to do with me. My family and I worked hard for what we have. We earned our way to where we are, right? This is the colorblind idea. You can be black, white, purple, or I don't know, it goes on from there. I don't know what purple's doing in there, but okay. I don't see race. Race doesn't matter. Really, every time you hear a white person say this, right, usually what they're trying to say is, I am not a intentionally racist person, and therefore I won't treat you differently, right? The disavowal in that is that whether you are the most angelic, Jesus-like human being, white human being, right? That doesn't stop you from still earning some of these, getting these privileges and advantages, whether it's the social privilege simply to not be discriminated against, right? So that we have to expand our definition of racism to not just include bigoted acts, right? But to really think through these other kind of iterations of racism that are not necessarily intentional, conscious, or specifically attitude-based, right? Minimizing. Race doesn't matter, you're just like us. Don't you think you're being a little too sensitive about this race stuff? Are you sure she meant it like that? I mean, why do we always talk about race? Aren't we just all human? The idea there is that, again, it's an equalization of a setting, of a site that isn't actually equal, right? It's a constant disavowal, a minimization of the fact. Don't highlight the fact that I am somehow have some privileges or advantages, right? That's the idea here. And also implicit in this minimizing for white folks is just generally to constantly affirm their own realities while not accepting the testimonies of other people whose experience is actually saying something quite different. Does that make sense? Displacement. Well, people of color are racist too. Here, there's this kind of idea that, you know, you can be a person of color and make, right, prejudicial comments about another ethnic, racial group that's not white, right? And of course, that can be the case. But the question is, who has the power to make their prejudice relevant? Right? I can be prejudiced all I want individually, right? But do I have the power to enact policies through which my prejudice will now produce disadvantages for this group that I want to be prejudiced toward? It's not the same, right? It's not the same. there's also this displacement currently that's happening